Hello and welcome. I'm Glenn Macy, Bryant University's Provost and Chief Academic Officer. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our panel, Restoring the Social Fabric, Opportunities and Challenges. This is the second of our 4 panels in our fall series entitled Paths to Recovery, Strategies for Getting Back to Work and to a Better Future. And our last panel was extremely well attended as well, and we thank Dr. Hopeness for her moderation of that panel and the success it enjoyed. In this series, distinguished experts will focus on the road to recovery from the perspectives of healthcare, social issues, as is today's panel, finance, and economic competitiveness. Each panel will examine how we can all work together to shape a stronger future. As our moderator, Neil Steinberg, has said, and he will touch on this more in his remarks today, we have to lead change. All of us can do our part to help our families, our communities, and our nation to recover. We are grateful for the continued partnership of the Rhode Island Foundation, which has worked with Bryant on the successful Pandemic Economics series this spring. We are also grateful for the sponsorship and support of Citizens Bank and Fidelity Investments. We are honored today to welcome Neil as our moderator for this panel. As the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Rhode Island Foundation, Neil Steinberg works to address the needs of Rhode Island's diverse communities through philanthropy, grant-making, and community leadership. Previously, Neil served as Vice President of Development at Brown University, his alma mater. He also served as Chairman and CEO of Fleet Bank, Rhode Island. As you can see, what a distinguished career. His civic engagement goes well beyond this to include work with the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council, the Providence Performing Arts Center, as well as the Urban League, a true example for all of us in these times. A sought-after expert on philanthropy, the Rhode Island economy, community issues, and public education, PBN named him one of the 30 driving forces in Rhode Island's business community. I invite you actually to read Neil's op-ed in the Providence Business News back in May, titled, "It's Up to Us to Make Rhode Island's New Normal a Better Future." Again, in the PBN back in May. And now, please join me in welcoming a friend of Bryant, Dr. Neil Steinberg, who will introduce our panelists and begin what is sure to be an excellent and informative discussion. Neil, welcome.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you for that kind introduction. I'm glad I'm the moderator, not the speaker, because you set up high expectations with that introduction. and welcome to everybody. This is, it's great to be with you. Thank you for joining us today. I'm honored to be your moderator in this important conversation. And I can't think of a better title, especially for us at the Rhode Island Foundation working with Bryant for the state, which is Restoring the Social Fabric. I think we all know the health pandemic aspect of this. I think that many of us have seen, obviously, the short-term and anticipating long-term economic impact, but the social impact is really significant and in some cases pretty severe. It presents opportunities and challenges. So it's the second of the 4 panels focusing on the path to recovery. And that's a very hopeful, optimistic, look forward approach that we embrace. Strategies for getting back to work and to a better future. As I said, the foundation, we're very, very committed to this and want to work with all of you. A special thanks to our sponsors, Citizens Bank and Fidelity, for their commitment and their support as great Rhode Island corporate citizens. As Glenn mentioned, back in May, I was honored to serve on the strategic leadership panel that kicked off the spring pandemic economics series. And at that time, a lot of people were talking about the new normal, getting back to normal and then the new normal. And it's bothered me a lot. And the reason it bothered me is the old normal just left too many people behind. And we need not the new normal, but we need a better future and a better normal for Rhode Island. Recently I read, and I can't remember where I read it, that 2020, this very difficult, challenging year that we're going through, is a combination of the 1918 flu pandemic, the 1933 depression, and the 1968 race riots all in one year. That's pretty imposing, but we're seeing aspects of all of that. So we need to create together this better future. And the pandemic has created and exacerbated a lot of problems in many of our communities. So people who were left behind before, people who struggled before, people who experienced gaps in education opportunities, employment opportunities, housing, racial equity, mental health, et cetera, et cetera. It's been exacerbated, it's been heightened, and it's been made more important by the COVID-19 pandemic. I have to say, it's not new. We knew this. There are many, many aspects there that we just have not addressed for many years, but we need to do that. This forum brings people together to explore ways to accomplish this. And it's great to have this conversation. Whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's our diverse populations, we must do better and we must look to the long term. So before we begin the discussion, before I introduce our distinguished panel, just a few brief parts of the overview. I'm going to introduce the panelists, as I said. We'll continue a rich and informative discussion from there. At the end of the program, there'll be an opportunity for audience questions. And what we'll ask you to do is submit questions during the program, whenever you think of them, into the Q&A box that's in the bottom of your screen. For some reason, it's the top of my screen, but that's my technical difficulty. The Q&A box is what you want. And then we'll have a team behind the scenes organizing the questions for me to ask. We have a lot of students today, and we want to make sure we hear from you too. No grades, I think, or at least I'll try and get you off on that. But this is a great opportunity to have people from many walks of life, different sectors of Rhode Island, with the students from Bryant to be able to engage and ask questions. So with that, I now have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished panelists. Brad Martin is the Professor of History and Dean Emeritus of Bryant University's College of Arts and Sciences. He is the author of The Other 80s, A Secret History of America in the Age of Reagan. He has also published extensively in the fields of recent US history, American studies, and Cold War cultural exchanges. Brad Martin received a bachelor's degree from Yale University, a master's degree from UMass Boston, and his PhD from Boston University, and we welcome him and his expertise. Rachel Flum has served as the Executive Director of the Economic Progress Institute since 2015. Previously, she was a Senior Policy Analyst with that institute, and she serves on the Permanent Legislative Commission on Child Care, the Rhode Island Early Learning Council, and the Child Support Guidelines Review Committee. She earned a Bachelor of Arts from Wellesley College and a Juris Doctorate from Georgetown University. Kelly Ramirez is the CEO of Social Enterprise Greenhouse and has taught social entrepreneurship at RISD, Salve Regina, Providence College, and Brown. Previously, she worked as a political analyst for the US State Department and served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Slovakia. Kelly earned both a bachelor's and a master's degree at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan, where she's also served as an adjunct professor. And Sandra Victorino is Director of Acute Care Services at the Providence Center. She's also co-founder of the Latino Mental Health Network of Rhode Island, which assists individuals in obtaining a Spanish-speaking therapist. And she's on the board of the Women's Fund of Rhode Island, and she earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in psychology at the University of Mary Hardin Baylor and a certificate of advanced graduate studies at Rhode Island College. As you could see, a very accomplished, a very knowledgeable, a very committed, and I will say, given their areas of expertise in their work, very passionate panelists. And thank you all for participating. So now we're going to get going on the panel discussion. I'm going to ask each member of the panel a question that we have established beforehand. We're going to give them 5 minutes to answer. I love doing this in person because I ring bells, I do a line across my neck to cut people off when they're long-winded. I don't have that opportunity here, so I'm going to ask everybody to kind of self-regulate for the 5 minutes so we can get through and have time at the end for questions, but I will also jump in if you're getting overly passionate, as they say. But thank you. So the first question, we're going to go in the same order that I introduced you for Professor Martin. What have tended to be the key social and policy dynamics of modern economic recoveries historically as you look at the US and Rhode Island? How can we look to the past and learn as we enter the future?
Thanks, Neil. Great lead in. If you look at recoveries since the Great Depression, I would say three things really jump out in terms of policy responses. One is the fact that economic shocks like this pandemic disproportionately affect those that are already vulnerable. There's been some discussion about that. There's secondly, a recurring tension around the role of government in these policy responses. And third, the role of the political environment in shaping priorities. Yes, there are challenges, but also great opportunities. And within that, are these policies working towards equity, or are they exacerbating existing inequalities? And I'm going to share my screen in a minute. I've looked particularly at housing in this because obviously it's a key social need, but it also represents the opportunity to rectify inequity and stimulate jobs in the economy through investment. So here's the screen. And what I have time to talk about is in red, actually. So you mentioned FDR's the New Deal. With the New Deal, you have massive intervention and investment by the federal government, also a massive attempt to provide relief for the poor. In housing, the federal government gets involved in the business of insuring mortgages and improving housing standards, but also increasing jobs through home construction. Through the Homeowners Loan Corporation, they make housing more affordable and prevent foreclosures, but also through beginning the practice of redlining makes federal policy complicit in residential racial segregation for decades to come. I'm going to skip over the 1970s, though it pains me. Those were some of my formative years, but we'll go to the 80s. The great inflation of the 1980s, the late Carter years, the early Reagan years, Reagan responds with tax cuts, with supply side economics, and social programs, for large and small, from job training to school lunches, were casualties of this. The working poor were among the most impacted. And just to give you an idea, means tested programs represented 18% of federal payments in that, but they represented 40% of the Reagan budget cuts. So, and this include, so you have, many people speak of the 80s as a time of a rise of social polarization. What the media comes to call the fairness issue in national politics crops up, and this includes cuts to federal subsidies and housing to the tune of 2/3, really. Not surprisingly, with the lack of available affordable housing, you have the rise of homelessness as a social issue in the 80s. Time magazine does a cover story on it. And closer to home, calls to Rhode Island shelters increase over 280% in the mid 80s. Closer to the present, something that most of us remember, the Great Recession of 2008, it's fundamentally intertwined with the housing industry, right? You have the subprime mortgage crisis. You have a fiscal stimulus in response, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Some economists and many partisans have argued that it was too weak a response, but the idea was to use, like in the Great Depression, use the heft of the federal government to pump money back into the economy and get the wheels out of the ditch. And this included the expansion of social safety net programs to prevent poverty, including money for low-income housing. So to get down even further in terms of equity, Obama, through the Housing and Urban Development, instituted stricter rules for eliminating discrimination and racial segregation, requiring all cities and towns that receive federal money to identify barriers to fair housing and create a plan for ending them. Now, on the campaign trail this year, in an election year already, the Trump administration has said, stop enforcing this in an effort to court white suburban voters. So that shows you the role of the political context that I highlighted at the beginning. Last time around, famously, Rhode Island was among the hardest hit, 11.3% unemployment, 27% drop in home prices. However, local housing authorities were able to use money from the Recovery Act to restore housing developments, create jobs, and put workers' wages back into the economy and contribute to tax revenues. And so with that, I hope to get an opportunity to apply some of this to the present moment, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists.
Great, thank you, Professor. And I just made a note of that because when we come back to you later, we'll ask you what the answer is for this time around. Thanks. Next question for our friend Rachel Flum. Rachel, this is putting you into a great position of power to determine what should the state's priorities be in seeking to assist the most vulnerable in our community. And we know the most vulnerable is a term that unfortunately is growing as unemployment has grown and susceptibility to COVID has grown. That's a bigger one. So what are the top priorities that you see that the state should have?
Well, thank you, Neil, and thank you for having me, Glenn. I really wish I were in that position of power, Neil. As you know, I am sadly not. But I'm pleased to be here to be part of this conversation today, and I look forward to learning from Brad and Kelly and Sandra. The first thing we would say to perfect that the state needs to do to protect all Rhode Islanders is to make sure not to pass an austerity budget when they finally come back to pass a budget. As we know, we're 4 months into the fiscal year without a budget that has passed, and we are not hearing that we're going to get any aid from the federal government. So I think the folks' first idea is, well, let's cut some services and some jobs. But as Brad just showed us, that does not work very well. So we recently put out a paper at the Economic Progress Institute and an op-ed that talked about how we argue the state can get to a balanced budget even without federal relief that does not cut services or jobs. Briefly, I would just say we talk about preserving revenue, being creative about borrowing, both bonding and otherwise, and then increasing taxes on those who are most able to pay and who haven't been so impacted by this crisis. So I know some of your other panels have addressed a lot of those different pieces, so I won't go into those today. But also budgetary wise, we think the better thing to do instead of cutting jobs and services is to actually make some targeted investments. I think Brad has shown us that when, in this case, the state does that, we see a better return on investment than cutting jobs. So I'm going to talk about 3 areas quickly. The first is investing in foundational skills for our adult workforce system. The second is housing. And then the third is around the care economy. So first, the COVID pandemic has had a devastating impact both on Rhode Island's workforce and on businesses, as we know. And as the state gets back to work, we know there will be many changes in the types of jobs available and shifts in economic sectors. But whatever the future looks like, we know that to promote economic mobility, both for workers and provide businesses with the workforce that they need, that we will need to make sure that all adults have foundational workforce skills. Those skills include English language proficiency, literacy, numeracy, and digital literacy. And the pre-COVID goal here in Rhode Island was to make sure that all Rhode Islanders had at least 2 years of post-secondary education or comparable credits. And that is certainly still true, but in the short term, we really urge the state to be laser focused on making sure that all our workers are equipped with these basic foundational skills. Unfortunately, we know that that is not the case now. We have 68,000 adults who lack a high school diploma or their equivalent, and we have about 31,000 working age adults who speak English less than well or not well at all. We also know that the pandemic has exposed gaps in technology access and digital literacy skills. So while folks kind of think a lot about that right now in terms of getting students able to get online for their Zoom classes, we also need to think about it for our adult ed. The state budget has not passed, and so the funds are starting to dry up for the providers who provide those skills. And the state right now is really focused on a back to work program, but those are higher skilled workers. So we would urge folks to really think about the lower skilled workforce and making sure that everybody is up to speed on those. The next thing is housing. As Brad mentioned, there have been investments in the past, but right now Rhode Island is spending 0 state dollars since our bond has been depleted on housing stock. We expect a huge uptick in homelessness after the CDC moratorium ends in December if something is not done. You know, this is both renters who have not had to pay their rent, who will then have to pay it and won't have the support to do that, and also lower income landlords who may lose their properties because they're not able to pay their mortgage, which would have rippling effects. So we would urge, you know, both a rental and mortgage moratorium at the same time that the state needs to come back and pass a housing bond to increase the stock of affordable housing. And lastly, I would say we know businesses come to a state and invest in a state where there's both housing, worker skills, and we argue the care economy really needs to be looked at. This pandemic has highlighted that our economy needs care providers, which we would define as both child care providers and senior caregivers. We know that those are essential workers who were not able to work from home and do their jobs. These are often low-wage workers, some earning definitely less than $15 an hour. And we are really concerned about those workers going to other states where the minimum wages are higher and the benefits are higher, and putting our state recovery really at risk. So we would urge the state to be thoughtful about reimagining that system, as well as sort of the individual caregiving structures. You know, I struggle to work from home with kids who are doing Zoom learning. You know, we've been able to adapt in some ways, but trying to think about how do we reimagine both the paid leave programs and the more structured caregiving systems so that they can support what the economy looks like going forward.
Great. Thanks very much, Rachel. A lot to think about and a lot to focus on there. Kelly, we know that Rhode Island is a small business state. We have a handful of big companies, but historically we have been a small business state and continue. We want to be probably more entrepreneurial than we are, but many of those small businesses were entrepreneurs when they started. How has the pandemic impacted small business, entrepreneurship, growing businesses for the future? And what are you hearing that people need, and how are you addressing that?
Unmuting myself.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Neil, and thank you to the entire Bryant team for putting together this really informative panel. And I want to echo what Rachel said. We're just seeing that the need is so immense and so great, both among entrepreneurs, existing small businesses, and individuals who have lost their jobs or experienced a reduction in hours and need to explore other opportunities. And that is really the first need. Is it seems highly unlikely that there are going to be enough jobs to fill the gap that exists now. And so we are seeing an uptick in interest in our existing services, such as our 6-week incubator program and our 12-week accelerator program. We immediately pivoted those to online, and we've seen our enrollment double. And I think some of that is just people have a little more time being at home. Services are more accessible online, but a lot of people are thinking about ways to supplement their income. Second need, a lot of existing business models are not working. So businesses really have to rethink how they can survive and thrive these times. So in response to that, we have launched a new adaptive strategy service where we're really just bringing together 4 or 5 of our expert volunteers and helping businesses really rethink the way that they are doing business and figuring out if there's a way that they can pivot to, you know, continue to do the work that they are doing. Of course, we work with businesses and nonprofits that are working to make the world a better place, whether that be increased access to education, healthy food, quality childcare, et cetera. We also are definitely having more of an emphasis on small business, particularly those that are led by people of color and are located in and or are serving historically excluded communities. And that need, really, we have just seen immense need. And part of it is, first of all, the small businesses, many small businesses are not tied to what I would say quite robust entrepreneurial ecosystem in Rhode Island. There are a lot of business support organizations, but a lot of small business owners are head down trying to, you know, keep their lights on, and they don't have time to sort of access resources or and are just disconnected. So really doing a lot of work to try to ensure that these businesses know about the resources that exist. And that, you know, that is for us, meaning that we're doing door-to-door outreach. We're making all of our services available in Spanish and English, and we're doing a lot of just custom support and meeting businesses and entrepreneurs where they're at. Another thing that we're hearing, you know, really on the social entrepreneur side is as a result of the pandemic, there are new social challenges, and existing social challenges in many cases are exacerbated. And in response to that, we launched a new program called the COVID-19 Incubator. We had 21 entrepreneurs participate in that, and they were really focused on building impact businesses that are responding to the new social challenges that we are seeing and experiencing. And just to go back to like specifically what we're seeing and hearing from small businesses that they need to professionalize. They need help on the financial literacy side. They need help on the digital literacy side. They need to have a web presence. They need branding help. I mean, the list really goes on, and every business is different. And so we're working to, you know, connect them to the resources that, again, can help them be able to thrive, but also be able to access. There are a lot of resources that are becoming available through Commerce RI, in particular, small grant programs for businesses, but making sure that the businesses are able to access those resources and take full advantage of what is available.
Great, thanks very much, Kelly. Sandra, how have you seen the pandemic impact the communities you serve? We know that the Black and Latino populations have been much heavier hit by the health pandemic. When you look at this, and I can't think of anything more important, to be honest with you, in the scheme of things, mental and behavioral health. We've seen this strain, isolation and suicide and substance abuse and domestic violence. How have you seen and experienced this in your area?
So I just want to say thank you, Neil, and thank you to Bryant University. And, you know, it's interesting because as we were going along with the panelists discussing from housing to employment to workforce, you know, and all those things have caused a huge impact on just us every single day. And then you have the vulnerable populations that have historically struggled with being connected to services. So, I mean, as, you know, the list goes on, you know, decrease in socialization can lead to social anxiety and depression. And we see the family stress with being able to provide their kids their educational system at home, where the parents are struggling with understanding some of the materials that are being sent home. Some of the things that I often hear is that things aren't being translated into different languages. How do we get our school system to do those things? Who do we connect with? So people aren't aware of their services that are in their community. So it makes it extremely difficult when we don't do a good enough job of putting it out there in our state. I think that pockets like myself, I've been a provider for 9 years in the Providence area and was 2 years in the East Bay area, I'm well aware of the resources that exist within Rhode Island, but our communities do not. And so one of the things that I've been seeing is that we lack in bilingual, bicultural providers. It makes it extremely difficult to be able to care for people with an interpreter involved, and with COVID restrictions, now you're doing everything through telehealth and, you know, teleconferencing, because some people don't have the access as providers and as clients to do video conferencing. So you're having to figure out things through phone, and community mental health centers don't always have the funding in order to be able to you know, provide the video conferencing. So I think that we can see the gaps tenfold in who can and cannot have access, but at the same time, it also has allowed some people that haven't had access to have access. So it's a very interesting time with this. And I do feel for the families that are trying to teach their children and not understanding the language that that's being sent home at times.
Great, thank you very much. So thank you all for those questions. I'm now going to try and foster a little more conversation amongst the panel. One of the things that we've seen, and it came out in some of your presentations, is, and I don't know if this is the best word, but this whole situation is patently unfair. So gaps that you mentioned a minute ago, Sandra, and that others have talked about are growing, whether they're income gaps, equality gaps, opportunity gaps, keep growing and growing. And what you see is we have record food insecurity in this state. And yet, if you go to the grocery store, food prices are very high. That if you're a minimum wage worker and you have to drive to work, gas prices are still pretty high. And I've never seen more high-end housing sell in the state of Rhode Island. You can't sell them fast enough in this state. And so it's a little bit worrisome. And it also speaks to the false sense of security of inflation. So if you ask the Fed, and I know Eddie Tibaldi's on here, he'll correct me later if I'm wrong, but if you ask the Fed, then they'll tell you we have minimal inflation. But if you're a person who has to go to the grocery store and you don't have a lot of money, if you have to get gas to get to your minimum wage job, and if you're struggling with rent, that's just not true. Your costs have actually gone up. And so I'd like to get feedback from the panel. And Brad, I'm going to save you for last because I'm going to ask you what we can do in this era after studying the previous eras. But how do we look at that? So Kelly, I'm going to start with you first. I know that your focus is small business. You talked about opportunity. What do you see as far as how that relates to this growing income gap, this growing equality gap, this growing opportunity gap, the fact that where your zip code is your destiny and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about access and, you know, social enterprise from kind of day one for our organization meant breaking down barriers and making opportunity accessible to all. And what we have learned over the years that to truly do that, you need to really focus and emphasize work in historically excluded communities. And that does not happen overnight. That requires, you know, trust, credibility, meeting people where they're at, understanding what existing resources exist and what are needed in the communities. And I will say what we have found over the last several months working with small businesses is, you know, many of them are not formalized. Business regulation and process has improved immensely in the state, but I think there's still a lot of misinformation. Businesses need help on that front. Again, connecting small businesses to existing supports, and that needs to be, you know, that can't just be social media or, you know, ads on NPR. It has to be, you know, going out into the community and putting up flyers and doing that door-to-door outreach. Access to capital is a huge one, and making sure that the businesses are ready to access that capital, that they have their financial processes in order, that they have the bookkeeping support that they need. And quite frankly, I think without continued sort of CARES Act support, it's going to be a disaster. And I just want to sort of close by saying, I think there are so many opportunities for people to get involved in this, and through our organization, Social Enterprise Greenhouse, we're always looking to engage with students. We have some paid internships that we'll be announcing to help small businesses develop websites and build their brands and do marketing and outreach. And we're always, looking for people who want to start ventures that are going to make our communities stronger and better. So I'll put my email in the chat. So if anyone would be interested in getting involved. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Sandra, how do you see this gap? You talked about it a little, but on behavioral health, while a few people might have access to things they didn't have before, a large number are isolated. The elderly are getting impacted, different communities getting impacted unfairly. How do you see that playing out longer term as it relates to behavioral health?
So I do feel that if we don't intervene, there will continue to be a gap. I do feel like some of the things that have happened in our nation over the past course of the last 3 months, and really exposing some of the inequities between different racial inequities, has really brought people to have conversations about what they can do within their organizations in order to be able to change or to adjust, or needing to relook at things. And I think that that's been very valuable. I've seen that a lot in conversations about that. And that brings out some of the inequities that we haven't been addressing. And I think we kind of tend to just move on and not remember that these communities exist. Thinking about some of the information that Brad brought up about housing inequities. I mean, that's something that has historically been happening here in Providence, and we've seen it more and more within our population, and not really being able to house people within as community workers. So I've been working for a community mental health center for 9 years, like I said.
Mm-hmm.
That makes it really difficult. Like we think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, correct? And if we don't do that, then we're really spinning our wheels with our community. And so they really need a job, they need finance, they need money, they need a house, and then we can really help support them with their mental health. Other than that, I feel like we could band-aid the situation.
Great, thank you. Rachel, the Economic Progress Institute, you are the students of the game, so to speak, with a lot of data and a lot of information. What do you see? I know you talked about the investments that we should make, and I think that's very important. Just as an aside, it's always been a concern here with the state, and I'm going to pick on our legislature, of being able to distinguish between $1 of investment and $1 of expense. One of the things that holds us back over the years is every time we do budgets, we look at it $1 of expense, and so then it gets cut, as opposed to $1 of investment in our future, and we need to do that more. But what do you see more in the analytics and in how you all look at it that looks at this gap and gives us either more cause for concern or maybe some hope on closing these gaps?
Sure. So yes, Neil, you certainly hear us talk about our data quite a lot. And we think it's important not just to research and come up with the data, but also use the data as to educate and empower our communities. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot optimistic to share on the data right now. We recently did analysis of the census level data that comes out that looks at how many Rhode Islanders are not making their basic needs, who are living below the poverty level. And although it was last year's data, the census has started to do a shorter term survey that they started since the pandemic. And the numbers are staggering of people who are unable to pay their rent and unable to feed children. And so I think right now it's really about crisis. I think the good news is people are starting to pay attention to the fact that not all recoveries are created equal across the state. So if you drill down in the poverty numbers or by race and ethnicity, we've long known that our Black and brown residents are 1 to 4 times more likely than white residents to live in poverty. But I think the current focus on race by a lot of people means that people are more willing to have the conversations about like why we got there. So not just look at the data, but really do the analysis of the historical reasons, systemic reasons that have led to those outcomes, and try to be more intentional about making sure that we address them more directly. To Sandra's point about how a lot of resources are not getting into the community because people don't know about them or they're not translated. One of the things that we do is to try to empower the community by sharing information about the programs that exist but in different languages and with community representatives who can talk to people directly, and then also to advocate with the state that they need to be doing that. So, the state's been very good about making sure that the workers understand what the challenges are and how to come back to work, but not so much on making sure that the employees themselves understand what they need to come back and what their options are if they don't feel safe or they need to take care of their children. And so we tried to plug some of those goals in multiple languages to make sure that there's equal access for that.
Great, thank you. Professor Martin, you gave us a very quick but very interesting look at history. It was fascinating to me. Hard to write history while you're in the middle of it. But what do you think? So there were a lot of policy decisions that were made, a lot of political decisions in the past, and then you gave us a very good snapshot of what the consequences are. Where do you see us now? What consequences? I mean, my sense is that if we had a vaccine at 5 o'clock today, that's great, and we'd all love that. It would take a year to get everybody vaccinated, and the tail of the economic impact, the tail of the behavioral health impact, the tails are going to take years to recover from. So how do you view it right now? I'm kind of asking you to predict, but be a little easier than that. How do you see it now compared to what you saw in history? Have we learned from history, or are we destined to make the same mistakes?
So, a couple things. One is, in 2020, we've had a federal stimulus. We have a second one that's still pending. If you've been following that in the last 24 hours, it'll make your head spin.
Right.
It's far from a done deal that will happen in the way that our panelists have talked about it needing to happen. The social policy response, I would argue, it largely remains to be seen. That's the point of this panel. But I think that various things that each of the panelists have talked about give some opening for opportunity. For instance, this quandary or this way of looking at things that you pose, Neil, with a dollar of investment versus a dollar of expense, that there is an importance of investing on the housing. I mean, these moratoria at the state level on foreclosures and evictions, that it's interesting that they're under the shield of the CDC and really a public health issue. I do think that's part of, should rather be viewed as, yes, being humane and Maslow's, hierarchy of needs, but also of investment, because those people, if that runs out and people are evicted or foreclosed, ultimately they're going to be a drain on resources, and wouldn't it be better to have them in the economy, have them with a job? Likewise, another thing with mental and behavioral health, my understanding is that in Rhode Island, the telehealth has been this temporary sort of measure that's addressed that, but its future beyond the first of the year is in question. So you know, to me, that seems like a no-brainer,
Mhm.
something to extend. And finally, you know, something Rachel said, just, you know, I think there is a, you know, historically, there is a increased willingness to discuss matters of race that have been hugely, you know, uncomfortable in the past. And it's taken some pretty horrible incidents to get there. But in that discussion and in that wanting to dig deeper and talk about the roots of these things, for instance, in my presentation, residential segregation,
Mhm.
you know, there's some hope that we're more able to talk about those things. And if anything is a silver lining or a hope for a beginning, that's it.
Are we going to see a book about 2020, like 1980s?
Well, you know, recent history has a lot of pitfalls, and including being proved wrong pretty quickly. But yeah, my current line is tracking towards the more recent stuff.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm going to ask some questions now. One that we have received was, what do any of the panelists think about the response to the COVID pandemic so far? Is the federal state government doing enough? Other than us all saying no, welcome anybody who wants to jump in about, has it been enough? What do you think of it so far? And I guess tangential to that, is it going to the right places, right people? Anybody want to volunteer?
I'll start us off.
Go ahead, Rachel.
So I would say there were some really positive pieces that came out of the federal stimulus pieces. We saw some paid leave policies that were the first time there had ever been a national paid leave program that supports families when they're either sick or have to care for a child who doesn't have childcare or school. I think some of the unemployment, the PUA, the federal unemployment boost, which boosts the state program, so it allows gig workers and folks who normally wouldn't be able to take advantage of UI, have been really positive because it's been a support for those folks who also are unable to work. The $600 boost to UI has also been extremely helpful. The stimulus payments that have gone to lower income folks, or not even low income, it's like middle and below folks, have really buoyed. But those all happened a long time ago. And so, you know, we really need another boost. Also, the boost for the state government have been extremely important in making sure that the economy didn't crash in a time where most things were closed, but they've all sort of run dry. I would also say, I think Rhode Island has done a very good job in terms of, we already had a paid leave program, so we could start very quickly and making sure people had access to those. Our UI system is better than most in the country, was able to get folks those services. And so there's certainly much more to do, as I reflected on in my opening remarks, but I think we've seen that things are possible, and where in the past people have said, oh, we can't make these kinds of investments, that's not true now. Like, we can invest in these systems and supports that help both states and individuals, and we should do that again.
Great, thanks. Anybody else?
So I can take a shot at this. So for what we've seen is for telemedicine. So I think that that's one of the things that was often stated that we could not do, or there were a lot of regulations around it. And we've seen that that is possible, and we just need to improve on it.
Yeah, that's a great example. You know, hopefully when Brad writes the book, he'll talk not only about the challenges, but while it's tough to be optimistic these days, there are pockets like that of telehealth, of different things. I can't help think, as many of us have, if this had happened to us 20 years ago, before all the technology we have, we wouldn't be doing Zoom meetings. We wouldn't have all had phones. Isolation would have been extreme without the channels of technology. So that's been a boost to some. Great, thanks. Another question we got from the audience was that throughout the course of the country's economic history, not only has the upper class, or those that have benefited from being more fortunate, been less affected by inflation, but have always been able to do better than those that are less fortunate, whether it's investments, it's housing, or whatever. And the question was, and we didn't talk a lot about public education, which we happen to believe is one of the most important things in this state, especially we need to invest in. But the question is, do we need to change public education to teach more financial literacy, to have people be able to do a basic budget, to have people be able to look at that difference between an investment and an expense as they're getting through critical times and also as they're planning for the future. Kelly, you know, one of the things about your work with small businesses and entrepreneurs is there's a very good element of wealth creation if things work out well. Wealth can be a small W or a big W. What do you think about that with the financial literacy?
Yeah, I mean, I can really largely speak just from the small business perspective and entrepreneur perspective. Absolutely, that is like the area where people that go through our programs need the most help. And we are doing some programming at the high school and the university level. And again, it's the same thing, that those are just fundamental skills that are needed. And so I think increasingly we're seeing other organizations step up also and try to respond to that need.
Yeah, thanks. I keep forgetting to remind everybody in the audience that if you would like to post a question, to use the Q&A function and we'll get it.
Neil, I wonder if I could touch on that last question too.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, as the resident academic in the room.
Well, this is interesting because there is already sort of a literature and a history about the 2008 financial crisis, and there was a lot of big calls for financial literacy education in the wake of that, and certainly there were some exploitative practices that caused that with the subprime mortgages and the payday lenders. And I would never write off the importance of that, but yeah, growing literature is also sort of stressed that that you want to be careful in that about putting the onus on individuals, right? With that, individual responses where many of these inequities need to be addressed with policy as well. So you never want to sort of give cover by putting the burden on individuals to acquire that financial literacy, which is certainly important, rather than good sound policy that can hopefully address everyone's needs.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, but not great. With this big divide, you have people that are saving. The savings record, last I read, we're at record levels of saving in this country because people who are working at home, if they still have a job, and they're not incurring expenses. On the other hand, we have many people who have eroded their savings if they had them just to live life. The percentage, I'm probably going to get it wrong, but maybe 60% of Americans don't have $400 of emergency funds. If they get a flat tire, can't buy a new tire. That gap, that inequity, that unfortunate financial situation is paralyzing to many people. And all of this that we're talking about, really this vibrancy, the pathways, the social fabric is critical as this country moves forward, because we need to have everybody be able to participate. We've touched on around the edges the equity questions. But the fact is, we really do need to address that. We need to be more inclusive. And it doesn't mean on the surface. We need to provide opportunities, not just outcomes. We don't get the outcomes without the opportunities. So anybody on, again, I'll throw this open to the panel, or we could pick on somebody, but how do you look at that? How do you look at the true inequities? How do we become more inclusive? Black Lives Matter has raised a consciousness in the country. It needs to keep going. The inequities that we've seen in the health outcomes have raised a consciousness. We need to keep going. How do you see it keeping going? Do you think it's going to erode when times get better? Anybody? I'll throw it open to anybody. It's a hard one.
So I can start.
Yeah.
One of the things that I often talk about one of the places that I learned the most information was from a history professor. So until we know our own story, we really can't understand where we're going. And so one of the things, as a person of a diverse background, migrant worker child, all of these things, I didn't know my history nor my story. So I didn't know my placement within this country as a first generation professional, first generation, person of the United States. I didn't understand my value. And so one of the things that I often talk to people about is really helping others understand each other's stories. And, going back to Brad's point of showing some of those inequities within the housing and how those things have played out over generations, I think that's something that we haven't talked about. We haven't talked about language about race. And Neil, thank you so much for the Rhode Island Foundation for bringing the Racial Equity Institute, because it was one of the things that really helped some of my colleagues that I've introduced to the racial REI understand some of the things that I felt internally, but never really had the language to articulate.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, that's what I do have.
Yeah, great, thank you. We had some discussion on housing, and we have a question. The Housing First policy that we put in place in Rhode Island to end homelessness was making progress. I know, Professor Martin, you've studied it. I know, Rachel, you're probably close to it. Has COVID-19 derailed that progress and what we're doing now about housing, do you think? I know the bond is on hold. The bond's not enough. We're the only state in New England that doesn't have a dedicated revenue stream for affordable housing. Rachel, you want to take that on Housing First was the specific question. Has that been derailed, or is that still on track, if you know?
So I am not actually a housing expert, so
No, I
Brad,
know.
if you have a good answer to this. I mean, I think the crisis right now is what's going to happen when the eviction rental eviction moratorium ends, right? Like we have people who it's both not enough affordable housing, but right now it's that we expect a lot more people to go back into homelessness or to start being homeless for the first time because they're unsupported. So the ground has shifted on that. My understanding is that people are continuing to work on a Housing First model, but the crisis that we're in has sort of shifted the immediate focus.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Professor Martin, you've looked a lot at housing. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'm on really shaky ground when you get the closer to the present you get. But I will say this, based on what Rachel just said, is that I do think the ground is shifting, right? And that if we're gonna, in a larger sense, if we look at this when we are able and fortunate enough to be able to look back on this period, hopefully, you're gonna. Historians always measure things in terms of what's legitimately new and what represents a distinct break with the past and what shows continuity with the past. And I think that my sense is that pre-COVID progress you're referring to is going to be the deck is going to be shaken up again, and we'll see what, like Rachel said, and we'll see what happens afterwards.
Yeah, I think if we're lucky, it'll be, one step back, two steps forward, and not the other way around. And
Right.
But COVID certainly has put a lot of things in. And the other thing, go back to, I think, Rachel's discussion and others on the budget, it's going to be priorities. And budgets are value statements to us, right? Your priorities recognize your values. And we're going to have a tough time. We're going to be halfway through the state's 2021 budget by the time they're looking at it, and then going into the next year. So we are right on time, which I know is no gold stars, but it is significant. I know everybody's busy. This has been a great discussion, I think. We heard a lot of realism, I think, from everybody on what the situation is. I don't think we heard anybody whining, which was great. I think we heard hope, which is the state's motto, And I think all of the panelists, and I want to thank Brad and Rachel and Kelly and Sandra, you all are part of the solution. And one of the messages I always like to leave people with is we all go to a lot of presentations, we hear a lot of speakers and everything. And the danger is sitting there and listening and thinking that somebody else is going to solve it, that somebody else is going to do everything. And the reality is the them is us. Whoever we think the them are, and everybody on this Zoom call, you can't wait. Students, community members, business leaders, nonprofit leaders, we all have to be part of that solution and step up. Leadership's created in the void. You step up. You don't wait to be anointed. So I would encourage everybody, and I think we want to thank Citizens of Fidelity Investments for sponsoring this. I want to thank Eddie Tibaldi for Bryant, who conceived of this whole idea of these sessions that are building on each other. And I think, Eddie, at the end, when we look back at all of these, there will be a body of knowledge that can help guard us. Having Provost Solomesi show the importance of this to Bryant and to the community. And I do want to recognize Cecilia in the background who made all this happen. She's sending us prompts and made it kind of idiot-proof for me to be able to do this. But the Bryant leadership, the community leadership that the panelists represent, the leadership and participation and future of all of you on the call, that's how we're going to take it forward. And we can do it. It may take a little time. We will go forward. And I will end it with a little advice. And after thanking everybody again, to look forward, be positive, and take rhetoric to action. Nike's got it right. Just do it. Thanks, everybody, and be healthy.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks to the entire panel.